For 22 years, Margaret lit a candle every September morning, whispering, "Happy birthday," to a son lost in the Twin Towers. No body, no answers, just ashes and silence. But on his 48th birthday, a letter arrived, postmarked from Afghanistan with handwriting she knew by heart. What it revealed shattered everything she believed and reignited the one thing she never let die: hope. What came next no mother could ever prepare for. Hit like and comment where you're watching from. Your support brings more amazing stories. Now, let's begin. Margaret Taylor's mornings had become a sacred ceremony. Not just habit, not just routine, sacred. It began at 8 a.m. sharp. She would shuffle to the wooden mantel in her New Jersey living room, wearing her soft blue house coat and slippers Brian had gifted her on her 60th birthday. She would pause to collect herself, one hand pressed to her chest, the other resting on the small polished box that held a single white taper candle. By 8:46 a.m., the exact time the North Tower was struck on September 11, 2001, her trembling hands would light the wick. She would whisper, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," then set down the same black and white photo. Brian in his cap and gown, grinning ear to ear, eyes bright with youth. It had been his 22nd birthday. 3 months later, he got the job at the World Trade Center. That was the last photo she had of him before that morning changed everything. Each year, she did this without fail. For 22 years, the world had moved on. Children born after September 11 were now adults. Memorials were broadcast. Speeches were made. But Margaret, she remained in that one moment. Her life had split into two before 8:46. And after she never got his body, only a burned ID badge mailed to her in a plastic evidence bag, the edges charred, her son's face still barely visible through the melted film. Brian Taylor, floor 92, North Tower. People told her to move on, that grief like hers needed to breathe. But they did not know what it meant to feel your child's presence in a room. Even when the chair across from you sat empty, she kept that chair in place all these years. Never once let anyone sit in it. This morning was no different, except for one thing. As she opened the front door to get the newspaper, something unusual caught her eye. A single envelope sat on the welcome mat. No return address, no markings except one. Postmarked Afghanistan military mail. The ink looked fresh. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. It was sealed, plain, and slightly heavier than usual, like something rested inside. She looked around. The street was empty. No mail truck, no footsteps, no sounds, just the faint chirp of birds and the breeze rustling the porch windshield with cautious fingers. She opened the envelope. Inside a birthday card, simple blue, the front read, "Getting older? Time to start lying about your age." It was the same joke Brian used to write in her cards. She froze. The handwriting inside. It was his. The birthday card slipped from Margaret's fingers and floated gently to the porch floor. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached back into the envelope, heart hammering, terrified of what she might find or not find. There was one more item inside. A folded piece of lined paper creased carefully like someone had taken great time and effort. The paper was aged, slightly yellowed, but the ink was fresh. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. She had read Brian's letters all through college, kept every single one. His Y still dipped too low. His T still leaned right. It was his. Every curve, every imperfection. "Mom, I never made it to the tower that day. I've been gone for too long and for the right reasons. I had to stay hidden to do what had to be done. But it's over now. I'm safe and I'm coming home." She read it once, twice, then a third time aloud, as if speaking it would make it real. Her knees went weak. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself, the wind brushing her cheeks as if in gentle reassurance. Was it a cruel prank? Some twisted joke? But who could mimic his writing so perfectly? Who knew the joke on the card or remembered her birthday was the same day as the attack? Only Brian. She sat down on the top porch step, staring at the horizon. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Something inside her, something old, something long buried began to stir. Hope. But no one came that day, nor the next. She did not tell her sister or the neighbors or the church prayer group. This letter, this impossible letter, belonged only to her for now. That night, Margaret placed the card beside Brian's photo on the mantel. She didn't light the candle again. She didn't need to. Its wax had melted fully that morning, the wick still smoldering. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without weeping. The next few days passed in a daze. She went through the motions, feeding the cat, watering the plants, sitting by the window in her rocker, but every sound outside made her flinch. Every car slowing down, every knock at the door. Then on the 7th morning, just after sunrise, a sound broke through the quiet. A car engine, slow, steady. Margaret's chest tightened as she pulled back the lace curtain. A silver sedan turned into her driveway. A tall figure stepped out. The man wore a dark coat, his hair grayer than she remembered, his face aged and weathered, but it was the eyes familiar, piercing. He looked up at her window. Then, as if no time had passed at all, he smiled and mouthed 2 words. "Hi, Ma." Margaret did not remember walking down the porch steps. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, as if her soul had recognized him long before her eyes did. She stood in front of the man who claimed to be her son, close enough to touch, but too afraid to reach. He had her boy's height, his posture, even the way he tilted his head when uncertain. But 22 years had carved time across his face, fine lines beneath his eyes, a small scar along his jaw. The brightness of youth had been replaced with something heavier, something that had seen too much. And still his eyes, Brian's eyes. He broke the silence softly, like a son afraid he might wake his mother from a dream. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mom." The sound shattered her. Her knees gave way. And he caught her before she could fall. She buried her face into his chest and sobbed. Not the way she had cried over grief, but the way a heart cries when it realizes it never truly broke. Just waited too long to feel whole again. They stayed like that for what felt like eternity. No neighbors, no sounds, just wind and the quiet murmur of a mother whispering prayers into her son's coat. When they finally stepped inside, everything felt surreal. Brian paused in the doorway, his eyes catching the photo on the mantel, the candle wax, the familiar furnishings frozen in time. He ran his fingers gently across the edge of the dining table. "It hasn't changed," he murmured. Margaret sat still shaking. "Where were you?" Her voice cracked under the weight of 22 unanswered years. He sat across from her, eyes low. "I never went to the tower that day. A friend from college, Jason, was working with a federal agency. He warned me something was coming. He begged me not to go to work. Said he'd explain later." Brian swallowed hard. "But that day, everything changed. The agency pulled me in. They said people who had advanced knowledge were now targets. And I had a choice. Disappear or put that knowledge to work." Margaret's hand went to her chest. "You chose to disappear. I chose to serve, Ma." In silence, I stopped attacks she never heard of. I buried friends with no names. I lived in shadows because it was the only way to keep others safe. "And me," she whispered. Brian's eyes welled. "Thinking about you was the only thing that kept me human." Silence fell, but it was not empty. It was full of unspoken years. She reached across the table and held his hand. "You never missed a birthday," he said. She nodded. "Because I never believed you were gone." Margaret made tea the way she always had. 2 cups, 1 spoonful of honey, and his, just like Brian liked. As she set it down before him, her fingers brushed his again. She still could not stop looking at him. Every wrinkle on his face felt like a missing year returned. Every blink of his eyes, a breath she had forgotten to take for over 2 decades. Brian sipped slowly, silently. The warmth seemed to steady him. "I never stopped wondering," she said gently. "Did you suffer? Were you alone?" He leaned back, eyes fixed on the rising steam. "I was never truly alone. Not in my head. You were there, Ma. Every morning before a mission, I'd close my eyes and picture you lighting that candle. It gave me more strength than any weapon ever could." Margaret's throat tightened. He continued, voice lower now. "I lived in deserts, mountains, compounds with no names. I was assigned to a covert counterintelligence unit operating under NATO's highest security clearance. My new name was Michael Dane. I couldn't keep anything. No photos, no letters, nothing from my past. They made me vanish so the enemies we were hunting would never find us." She reached out. "You were hunting terrorists? One's planning the next September 11th, one's already inside countries blending in. I stopped attacks that would have filled cemeteries." Tears pulled in her eyes. "But at what cost, Brian?" He hesitated. "We lost people. I lost myself more than once. But I stayed because I believed it would end someday. That I'd come home not in a flag-draped box, but walking, whole." His voice cracked. "I did not think they would ever let me leave. But 2 months ago, after a final mission near Kabul, we were pulled out. They said it was over. My name was declassified. They gave me the choice." Margaret blinked. A choice to stay and train others or finally come home. She smiled through tears. You chose right? He grinned faintly. I chose you. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I brought you something. Inside was a charm. Old silver, worn from the elements, a tiny engraved flame. It's what I kept when I couldn't keep anything. Hidden in my boot for 22 years. She held it to her heart. He looked around the house again. You waited for me. Margaret nodded slowly. Every day. A long silence stretched between them, but it was no longer filled with grief. It was peace. The news traveled fast, though Margaret had not meant for it to. She had told no one, no church friends, no neighbors. But stories like this had their own wings. It started with the mailman who spotted the unfamiliar car in her driveway for 3 days straight. Then Mrs. Hargrove across the street noticed Margaret walking with someone taller, someone who paused at the flagpole in her front yard every morning when a curious retired journalist from town asked gently, "Is that who I think it is?" Margaret had simply smiled and said, "He's home." The next morning, a black SUV pulled into her driveway, federal plates. 2 men in suits stepped out and greeted Brian with quiet deference. They had come not to take him, but to thank him. One leaned in and said, "You saved more than you'll ever be allowed to know." Margaret watched from the porch, arms folded across her sweater, lips tight with pride. They gave him a plaque. No cameras, no medals, just a simple inscription for service in silence. For sacrifice without applause. That night, Margaret made his favorite meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and her famous apple pie. He laughed when he saw the table set just like it had been in 2001, right down to the mismatched salt and pepper shakers he had teased her about. Since high school. They talked late into the night of everything, of nothing, about how he used to dream of this, about how she never moved his old jacket from the coat rack by the door. It still hung there, waiting like she had, but somewhere after midnight, Brian grew quiet. "I missed your voice the most," he said. "I would try to remember it during the worst moments. But memory fades when you have nothing to hold on to." Margaret stood, walked to the old answering machine, still plugged into the wall, and pressed play. A beep, then her voice, "Hi, sweetheart. Just calling to say, I love you. Happy birthday." It was a message she had recorded every year, never deleted, just in case. Brian broke down. The next morning, the candle was gone from the mantel, not forgotten, retired. In its place was the silver charm nestled beside his old photo, now replaced with a new one. A picture of him and Margaret on the porch, sunlight pouring around them. For the first time in 22 years, the chair across from hers was no longer empty. And the silence in the house, it finally sounded like peace.